There's a kind of broken that doesn't show on the outside. No bruises, no bandages, no visible wounds. Just a woman stepping off a stage with her jaw set tight and her eyes aimed at the ground. The kind of look that says don't ask, don't touch, don't try. Most people respected that look. Most people stepped aside. But there was one man standing at the edge of a dusty New Mexico trading post in the summer of 1874 who didn't step aside. Not because he was bold, not because he was foolish. Because he recognized the look. He'd worn it himself, for 3 years after Gettysburg, after the farm, after the letter that arrived with someone else's handwriting and his wife's name signed at the bottom. He knew what it meant when a person arrived somewhere not because they wanted to, but because they had absolutely nowhere left to go. His name was Emmett Crail. He was a rancher, a failed poet, and a man who kept a leather journal not because anyone told him to, but because the silence of the frontier had a way of swallowing thoughts whole if you didn't write them down fast enough. This is what he wrote about her. This is what he saw that no one else bothered to look for. Some people arrive like weather. You can feel them coming before they get there. She was one of those. And I don't know if I helped her or she helped me, but I know neither of us was the same by the time the first frost came. From the personal journal of Emmett Crail, Crail Ranch, New Mexico Territory, 1874. What follows is 3 parts of one truth. Don't rush it. The stage from Santa Fe came in 40 minutes late, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that it came in quiet. Normally you could hear the Butterfield coach from half a mile out, the driver cursing at the horses, passengers arguing about the dust, someone's child crying in a pitch that could strip bark off a juniper. But this one rolled in under a sky the color of old brass, and the only sound was the creak of the axle and the hollow knock of the wheels on the hardpan. I was at the trading post because I needed wire and salt and my canteen had a leak I'd been ignoring since April. That's it. That's the only reason I was there. I want to be honest about that because later people in Manzano like to say I was waiting for her like I'd known something. I hadn't known anything. I was there for salt. The driver climbed down first. He was a man named Cordell who I recognized by his hat, a brown derby missing its left brim, which he'd lost in a bet the previous year, and refused to discuss. He moved around to the door with the slow deliberateness of a man who had been in the driver's seat too long, and whose knees were informing him of this fact in real time. 3 passengers stepped out. A cattle buyer with a leather satchel who immediately began scanning the horizon like he was assessing value in it. A Mexican priest who crossed himself, looked up at the sky, and then walked directly toward the post's water trough without speaking to anyone. And then her. She came out last. She was maybe 30, maybe 35. It was hard to tell, because exhaustion has a way of adding years to a face, and I wasn't sure how much of what I was seeing was time and how much was circumstance. Dark hair pulled back with a practicality that said this was function, not fashion. A gray traveling dress that had seen better days but was clean, someone who'd lost resources but not habit. Small leather bag, the kind that holds essentials only, which tells you everything about a departure made in a hurry. She stepped down from the coach and stood absolutely still. That was the thing. The cattle buyer was moving, the priest was moving, Cordell was already unhooking the luggage from the back. Everyone moved. She stood completely still in the middle of the yard with her bag at her feet and her eyes moving in a slow, deliberate scan of the landscape, not like she was admiring it, but like she was calculating whether it was survivable. I know that scan. I've done it myself. I wrote in my journal that evening. She looked like a woman taking the measure of a country she didn't choose but intended to survive anyway. I thought that was perceptive at the time. Later I understood I'd only seen the surface of it. Her name, I learned over the following week, was Nora Voss. She'd come from Albuquerque, before that from Taos, before that from Denver, before that. And this part came out slowly, in pieces, over coffee and brief exchanges in the weeks that followed, from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she'd had a husband, a small house on Elm Street, and a daughter named Clara who had died of scarlet fever in the winter of 1873. The husband had not survived the grief the way she had. Or rather, he had survived it in the way that some men survive things, by replacing the unbearable fact with something more bearable. In his case, a woman named Judith who wore brighter colors and asked fewer of him than grief did. She'd left before she did something she couldn't undo. That was how she described it later. I left before I did something I couldn't undo. She said it plainly, like a fact about the weather, but her hands were flat on the table when she said it, and I noticed she pressed them down into the wood as though she needed to feel something solid. I didn't ask what the something was. A person who survived that much has already explained it to themselves more times than they should have to, and they don't need a man with a salt order and a leaking canteen demanding another recitation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The trading post at Manzano was run by a man named Del Guthrie, who I respected professionally and found personally exhausting. He was generous with credit, honest in his measurements, and constitutionally incapable of silence. He narrated every transaction he completed the way a preacher narrates scripture, with conviction and at length. When Nora Voss walked in and asked about lodging, Del spent 4 minutes describing the 2 available options, a room above the post which was small, and a room at the Medina house a 1/4 mile east which was slightly larger, while she stood with her bag and her stillness and waited for him to finish. She took the room above the post. I was still there when she made the arrangements. Not lingering, I want to be clear, but my salt order was taking longer than expected because Del had miscounted his own inventory and was annoyed at himself about it in a vocal way that required some time to process. I was sitting on the bench near the door with my journal open, writing nothing in particular, just keeping my hand moving because that's what I do when I'm waiting and thinking at the same time. She walked past me on her way to the stairs. She stopped. "You're writing," she said. It was such a plain observation that I wasn't sure how to respond. "Trying to," I said. "What do you write about?" "Whatever's in front of me." She looked at me then, a direct, unhurried look that some people find unsettling because it means the person doing it isn't afraid of what they might find. "Does it help?" she asked. I thought about that. "Sometimes it just documents," I said, "but documenting is something." She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that means I'm filing that away, and went upstairs. Del appeared at my elbow approximately 11 seconds later. "She's from back east," he said. I got that impression. Traveling alone. Woman traveling alone this far out usually means something happened. "Del," I said, "your salt count." He went back to the salt. "I want to tell you about the Apache camp, because it matters, not as backdrop, not as local color, but because it's threaded through everything that happened, and I'd be telling only part of the truth if I left it to the edges." There was a small encampment about 4 miles southeast of Manzano, a band of Western Apache who had been moving through this part of New Mexico for years in a pattern the Army called unpredictable, and I called logical, because it followed water and game in exactly the way you'd expect if you paid attention to the land instead of a map. Their leader was a man named Saguaro, which wasn't his Apache name, that I never learned, but what he went by in trade dealings, a name he'd acquired from a conversation years earlier with a botanist from Philadelphia who'd been obsessively cataloging cacti and given the name to him apparently as a gift, which Saguaro found either amusing or baffling, possibly both. I'd traded with them twice. Horses once, blankets the second time. Saguaro spoke enough English for business, and I spoke enough to mean it, and we'd established the kind of mutual regard that doesn't require friendship but does require honesty. The Army had a patrol that came through Manzano every 3 weeks, and the officer in charge, a young lieutenant named Hartwick who believed very firmly in his own authority, considered the Apache presence to be a problem he was managing. Saguaro considered Hartwick to be weather, inconvenient, temporary, and not worth arguing with. The situation had been stable. What I didn't know yet, the morning Nora Voss arrived, was that it was about to become unstable. And I didn't know that she would be part of why it didn't fall apart completely. She stayed in the room above the post for 3 days before she came down for anything other than water. On the 4th morning, she appeared at the bottom of the stairs just before dawn with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and asked Del if there was work. Del stared at her. "Work," she said again. "I can keep accounts, I can inventory, I have legible handwriting, and I can do arithmetic faster than most." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking if there's use for what I can do." Del, who kept his accounts in a system of his own invention that had long since ceased to be interpretable by anyone but himself, looked at the pile of receipts on his counter, and then back at her and said, "How fast is fast?" She picked up a receipt, scanned it, and added the column at the bottom in about 12 seconds. "That fast," she said. Dell hired her. I was there for this too, but only because I'd come back for Axel grease, which I'd also forgotten. I want to note that my pattern of returning to the trading post with forgotten items is not evidence of anything strategic. It's evidence that I am not organized and never have been. She caught me watching her from the door and gave me the same direct look as before. "You came back," she said. "Grease," I said, "for the Axel." "Of course," she said, and went back to Dell's disaster of a ledger. I stood outside with my Axel grease and thought about that for longer than I should have. On the 5th day, I did something that in retrospect was either kind or intrusive, and I've never been entirely sure which. I rode out to the Apache camp. Not because of her. Because of a separate matter. I had a horse that had been favored by a shoulder injury, and I'd heard that Saguaro's people had a woman healer who worked with horses in ways that made the army surgeon's methods look barbaric by comparison. This was true. I'd seen it before. I'd gone for the horse. But I mentioned Nora's arrival to Saguaro while we sat and drank the tea his wife prepared, a tea made from something I'd never identified, but that tasted like pine and something slightly sweet and was always stronger than I expected. I described her briefly. The stillness, the way she scanned the landscape, the thing about the journal. Saguaro listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I respected about him most. When I was done, he said, "Is she dangerous?" "To herself, maybe," I said. "To anyone else, no." He thought about that. "People who have lost a child are sometimes the most dangerous," he said, "because they have nothing left to protect that they haven't already lost." I sat with that for a long time on the ride back. On the 7th day, the situation with Lieutenant Hartwick became something more than weather. He arrived at the trading post with 4 soldiers and a complaint that had been building for 2 weeks. Someone had taken 3 horses from the army corral outside of town, and Hartwick had decided, on the basis of a trail that led southeast and his own existing suspicions, that Saguaro's people were responsible. There was a moment in that post, I was there again, I'll stop explaining why, where everything that could go wrong was balanced on the edge of one man's certainty. Hartwick had that particular kind of certainty that comes not from evidence, but from the need to act. He was young enough to still confuse decisiveness with accuracy. He laid out his case to Dell as though Dell had any authority, his voice carrying the formal weight of someone who had been told his rank conferred judgment and had believed it without question. I was going to say something. I was forming the words. Nora said it first. She came down the stairs with Dell's ledger under her arm, took one look at Hartwick and said, "What horses?" Hartwick turned. He hadn't noticed her. "Ma'am, this is an army matter." "What horses?" she said again, not a question. A demand restated for someone who hadn't heard it correctly the first time. She made him describe them, coloring, markings, age. She stood there with the ledger and made him answer every question with the patience of someone who had been waiting for facts to catch up with conclusions for a very long time. Then she said, "Dell, didn't Morales bring in 3 horses 2 days ago, before sunset?" Dell, who had the look of a man watching a fire he hadn't started, said, "He did." "Were 2 of them army chestnuts with shod feet, and one a roan with a split ear?" Dell thought the roan had something wrong with the ear, yes. She looked at Hartwick. "Morales is a horse trader who comes through from Tucson every 6 weeks. He was here 2 days ago. He'll be in Santa Fe by now." She placed Dell's ledger on the counter, opened it to the page she'd been working on, and pointed. "I've been rebuilding Dell's accounts. Morales's transaction is logged right there." Hartwick looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He didn't thank her. Men like that rarely do. But he didn't ride to the Apache camp either, and that was the only thing that mattered. When he left, she picked up the ledger, went back upstairs, and didn't say another word about it for 2 days. I stood in the middle of Dell's trading post, holding my journal and wondering what, exactly, I'd been thinking about wrong. After the Hartwick incident, people in Manzano started to talk about her the way people talk about things they don't fully understand, but can't stop thinking about. The women at the Medina house said she was cold. A woman who'd gone through what she'd gone through ought to weep openly. They felt, ought to lean into grief the way you lean into a wind with your whole body. Her composure disturbed them. They read it as absence of feeling rather than its opposite. The men were less generous. A few of them came by the trading post in the weeks that followed with reasons. They needed nails. They needed rope. They needed Dell's advice on something. And what they actually needed was to look at her and see if they could get a read on the situation, which is what men do when a woman appears who doesn't need anything from them. She didn't help them with this. She was polite. She was precise. She answered what was asked and didn't answer what wasn't. She did Dell's accounts with a thoroughness that revealed, among other things, that a man named Tate Burrows had been undercharging himself for goods for a period of approximately 8 months, a sum that came to $14.60, which Dell collected without drama. I came to the trading post twice a week, which was slightly more than necessary. I told myself it was because Dell had better coffee than the ranch, which was true. I didn't examine the rest of it very closely. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks after her arrival, I came in to find her not at the counter, but sitting outside on the bench I usually occupied, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the mountains to the east. The Manzano Mountains in early morning have a quality that I've tried to describe in writing and have never managed to do justice to, a kind of blue-gray stillness that makes the light seem borrowed, like the day hasn't quite decided yet whether to show up. I sat down at the far end of the bench. We didn't speak for a while, that was fine. I'm capable of not speaking when not speaking is what the moment needs. This is rarer in me than I'd like. Then she said, "Tell me about the Apache." I looked at her. "What do you want to know?" "The man you trade with, Saguaro. What kind of man is he?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "The kind who listens more than he speaks and means both things equally," I said finally. "The kind who's been offered a lot of reasons to be done with white men and has decided on a calculation I don't fully understand to keep engaging anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Is the calculation working?" "Most of the time," I said. "It came close to not working last week." "Yes," she said. "It did." She turned to look at me then, and there was something in her face that I hadn't seen in the 3 weeks I'd been paying attention, a crack in the composure, not large, just enough to see light through. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out why I did that," she said. "The ledger, Hartwick." "You knew the answer and he had the wrong one," I said. "I've known the answer before," she said. "I've watched wrong ones proceed regardless." She looked back at the mountains. "I think I was angry," she said. "I think I've been very, very angry for a long time, and it finally found a shape that felt useful." I wrote that down later, exactly as she said it. I couldn't not. She started coming to the post's doorway in the evenings, after Dell closed up, and I started arriving slightly later than I needed to so that our departure times coincided with some regularity. This was a thing we did without ever discussing it, which I've found is how the most important things between people tend to begin. She talked about Cincinnati with the precision of someone who had decided that facts were safer than feelings, and that if she gave you enough of the former, she could keep you away from the latter. Clara had been 4 years and 7 months old. She had liked horses and disliked most vegetables, and had a habit of carrying small, smooth stones in her pockets, collected from wherever she went. The house on Elm Street had a yard with one oak tree that Clara had named Oliver, after a boy in the neighborhood she admired. I listened. I wrote nothing down while she was talking, which cost me something, but the journal could wait. There's a thing that happens when a person tells you the particular details of someone they've lost, not the general shape of the loss, not the fact of it, but the specific accumulative texture of who the person was. The stones in the pockets, the named tree, the boy Oliver. It makes the absence real in a way that grief as a category never can. I felt it physically, a tightening in the chest that I recognized from 3 years after Gettysburg, when I'd finally let someone describe to me what had happened to my brother Hale in the field at Cold Harbor. The anger she'd described, I understood it. Grief that old and that unwitnessed has no place to go, and it builds pressure, and eventually it will find a shape, useful or otherwise. The useful shape she'd found, temporarily, was Hartwick's certainty. I wondered what she'd do with it when there was no Hartwick. On a Sunday in late September, Saguaro came to the trading post. This was not unusual. He came for supplies and trade every few weeks. But the timing mattered because Lieutenant Hartwick was also in Manzano that day, conducting what he called routine presence, which meant he rode through town slowly to remind everyone that the army was aware of things. The two of them met in front of the trading post. It was not a confrontation. It was something quieter and more dangerous than a confrontation. A moment of mutual assessment where both parties understood the terms clearly and neither flinched. Hartwick spoke first, which was predictable. He asked what Saguaro's business was. Saguaro said in English, trade. One word held in the air like an answer to a question Hartwick hadn't quite asked. Hartwick had learned from the Ledger incident not to overextend, but he hadn't learned to be comfortable with restraint. He was working on a response when Nora appeared in the post's doorway. She looked at both of them. She looked for slightly longer at Saguaro. Then she said, in a voice that was conversational and entirely not directed at Hartwick, "Dell's expecting him. He's been waiting on the blankets." Saguaro looked at her, a real look, the kind that measures. Hartwick had no visible role in the sentence she'd just said, and no good reason to create one. He rode on. Saguaro walked past Nora into the post, and I watched him pause just inside the door and say something to her quietly. I was too far away to hear it. She nodded. Later I asked her what he'd said. She took a moment. He asked where I came from. I told him the East. He said people come from the East for two reasons, because they want something new or because the old thing is too heavy to carry anymore. She paused. He said I looked like the second kind. What did you say? I said he was right. She was quiet. He said the second kind are sometimes more honest about what a place is worth, because they're not looking for something, they're just trying to be somewhere that will hold them. I sat with that for a considerable time. The trouble came from a direction I hadn't been watching. A man named Luther Cross arrived in Manzano on a Tuesday morning with a mule and a grievance, and a letter from a land agent in Albuquerque, suggesting that the parcel of land 4 miles southeast of town, the land near the Apache camp, had been surveyed and was available for homestead claim. I knew that land. I'd ridden across it. It was water adjacent in 2 places, which was why the Apache used it, and it had a particular quality of flatness near the southern edge that made it visually inviting if you were the kind of person who looked at land and thought, what can I build here? Cross was exactly that kind of person. He was pleasant about it in the way that some men are pleasant when they're certain, because their certainty is large enough to be generous in. He came by the trading post, told Dell his plans, and said he intended to go out and mark the claim boundaries in the next few days. Dell, who knew the lay of things, went quiet in a way that said more than speech. Cross noticed the quiet. Is there a problem with the parcel? Dell said there was an Apache encampment nearby, which Cross acknowledged, saying the army had assured him the Apache in this area were managed. I heard all of this from the far end of the counter. I thought about Saguaro's calculation, the one I didn't fully understand. I thought about how many times a calculation like that can hold against the pressure of encroachment before the variables change in ways that make the old arithmetic invalid. I should have said something right then. I didn't because I was trying to decide what the right thing to say was, and by the time I'd decided, Dell had moved on to Cross's supply list and the moment had passed. Later that evening, I sat on the bench outside and told Nora about it. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, how much of that land does Saguaro actually use? The southern flat, not much. The 2 water sources, considerably. And the homestead claim, does it include the water? I thought back to what Cross had said, the land agent's letter, the boundary description. I don't know. She looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was about to do something that other people would find surprising, and she'd been doing quietly in her head for 20 minutes already. I need to read that letter, she said. Cross isn't going to show you his land agent letter. No, she said, but he'll show Dell if I ask Dell to ask him to verify the survey numbers for the trading post records. Dell keeps records of land activity near town. It's a reasonable request. I looked at her. I've been rebuilding Dell's accounts, she said. He does keep those records, it's not even a lie. The letter, when Dell obtained a viewing of it on the pretext Nora had constructed, revealed that the boundary description was poorly drafted. The western edge of the claimed parcel ran, in the letter's language, from the standing rock formation to the dry wash. which was geographically ambiguous because there were 3 standing rock formations in that direction, and 2 of them were positioned in ways that would put the water sources either inside or outside the claim depending on interpretation. Nora sat with the letter's transcription. Dell had written down the key phrases while Cross was distracted by coffee and went quiet for a long time. "He could challenge it," I said. "Saguaro, if there's a dispute about where the boundary actually falls." "He can't challenge it," she said flatly, "not through any process that will hear him." She was right about that. I knew she was right about that, and I'd said the stupid thing anyway, because sometimes you want there to be a path that doesn't require you to do something difficult. "The agent in Albuquerque drafted this badly," she said. "Intentionally or not, it's ambiguous. If someone were to write to the land office and request a formal resurvey before the claim is filed, citing the ambiguity in the boundary description, that would slow it down." "That would slow it down," she agreed, "potentially long enough for other options to present themselves." "Who's going to write that letter?" She looked at me. I looked back. "I'm a rancher," I said. "I have no particular standing to." "You're a property owner in the area," she said. "That gives you standing, and I have very legible handwriting." I sat with that for longer than was useful. "What happens if Cross finds out?" "Someone slowed down his claim," she said. "He'll be annoyed, he'll try again, but trying again takes time, and during that time the situation might change." She paused. "People like Cross rely on momentum. Take the momentum away, and sometimes the whole project loses interest." "And sometimes it doesn't," I said. "Yes," she said, "sometimes it doesn't." She looked at her hands, flat on the table again, pressing down. "But doing nothing removes that second option entirely." I thought about Saguaro's calculation, the one I didn't fully understand. "All right," I said, "draft the letter." She wrote it that night. She brought it to me the next morning with Dell's stamp on it, Dell, who had been briefed and had agreed with the look of a man relieved to have a path that wasn't his idea, and I read it twice. It was precise and formal and impeccably polite, and it contained, threaded through its official language, a sequence of implications that would make any competent land agent extremely nervous about the ambiguity in the survey description. "Where did you learn to write like this?" I asked. "Cincinnati," she said. "My husband was in property law," she said it simply. No edge in it, just fact. But she'd turned slightly away when she said it, which was the kind of micro-movement that means something. I signed the letter. We sent it with the Tuesday Courier. The letter reached the land office in Albuquerque and produced exactly the effect Nora had predicted: a request for clarification and a suspension of the filing process pending resurvey. Cross was annoyed. He came by the trading post and said so to Dell in the way that men express annoyance when they suspect something but can't prove the specific thing they suspect. He used words like bureaucratic obstruction and pettifogging, which I'd only ever seen in legal documents before, and which, I reflected, he probably had too. Dell listened with the patience of a man who has been managing difficult customers for 30 years, and said that land office bureaucracy was indeed a trial, and offered Cross coffee. Nora was not in the post when Cross came by. This was not coincidence. I told her about it afterward. She listened without expression and then said, "He's not finished." "I know. He'll request the resurvey, and if the boundary falls the wrong way, he files again." "How long does the resurvey take?" "Months maybe if we're fortunate." She was quiet. "What are Saguaro's options in the meantime?" "He could move the camp north," I said. "But there's no reliable water north of here until you get to the Rio. That's 3 days." "What does he want to do?" "I don't know. I'd have to ask him." She looked at me with the same expectant directness I'd seen when she'd handed me the letter to sign. "Then ask him." I went to the Apache camp the following week with a leg of salted pork and a jar of the honey Dell stocked in summer, and the distinct feeling that I was about to have a conversation I didn't have the right vocabulary for. Saguaro received me at the edge of camp, and I told him what had happened with the letter, what was happening with Cross's claim, what the boundary ambiguity meant. I told him all of it. He listened, he didn't interrupt. When I was finished, he was quiet for what felt like a long time, and then he said, "The woman at the trading post." "Nora Voss," I said. She wrote the letter. It wasn't a question. She drafted it, I signed it. He was quiet again. She lost something, he said. Yes. People who have lost something sometimes help and sometimes break. He looked out toward the south, toward the flat land that Cross wanted. Which kind is she? I thought about the hands pressed flat on the table, the precise anger finding a useful shape, the letter drafted in a night. I think she's trying to figure that out herself, I said. Saguaro almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, the expression was more in the eyes than the mouth, but it was the direction of one. Tell her we are grateful, he said. She wouldn't want gratitude. I know, he said. Tell her anyway. The resurvey came back in November, 2 months and 9 days after the letter. The boundary was redrawn. The western edge, under formal survey, was established at the nearer of the two standing rock formations, which placed both water sources outside the homestead parcel. Cross's land agent had made a genuine error in the original description. Whether intentional or not, the formal survey made it irrelevant. Cross filed his claim on the redrawn parcel. He had the land, he just didn't have the water. 6 weeks later, he offered to sell. A homestead without reliable water in New Mexico territory is a monument to optimism, and Cross turned out to be more pragmatic than optimistic. He sold to a family from Texas named Ochoa who had a different plan for the parcel that didn't involve water in the same way. The Apache camp remained where it was. I don't want to tell this like it was a victory. It wasn't clean enough to be a victory. The land situation in New Mexico territory in 1874 was not going to be resolved by a letter to a land office, and Saguaro knew that, and I knew that, and Nora knew that. What the letter bought was time. What time bought was possibility. What possibility did with itself depended on 1,000 things none of us controlled. But the camp was there in November. It was there in December. It was there when the first real snow came, and the mountains turned white in a way that made them look like something out of a church painting. I wrote all of this down. In October, between the letter and the resurvey, something shifted between Nora and me that I find difficult to describe with the precision I usually try to maintain. I don't mean that the shift was imprecise. I mean that it had the quality of something that happens in the space between words, in the pauses, in the silences that had by then accumulated enough shared content to mean things by themselves. She had started coming to the ranch occasionally, not to stay, to help with the accounts that I kept in the same system of willful disorganization as Dell, which meant they were technically accurate but practically useless. She sat at my kitchen table with the ranch ledger and brought order to it with the same thoroughness she'd brought to Dell's disaster of a system, and I made coffee and stayed out of the way and tried not to watch her work in the way I was watching her work. One evening in mid-October, she stayed later than usual because a discrepancy in the cattle numbers required us to go back through 3 months of records, and by the time we'd found the error, a duplicate entry from July that had propagated forward. The light outside had turned the color that means you've been working longer than you planned. She closed the ledger, she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "What did you lose?" I looked at her. "Why?" "Because you recognized it," she said. "That first day you recognized the look." She waited. "You didn't ask me what happened, you didn't explain anything, you just saw it and let it be." She paused. "People don't do that unless they've been there." I thought about how to answer honestly. "My brother," I said finally, "at Cold Harbor, and then afterward my wife left. Not the same as what you went through, I know that. But grief has a grammar, different words, same grammar." She was quiet for a moment. "Your journal," she said, "does it help?" "Sometimes it just documents," I said, "but documenting is something." She looked at me for a moment. "You said that to me," she said, "the first day." "I know. I've been thinking about it since." I didn't say anything. I'd found that with her, the instinct to fill silence was something to resist. "I haven't been able to write," she said. "Since Clara, I used to keep a commonplace book, quotations, observations, small things. After she died, I tried to keep it, and I couldn't. Every observation felt like it was happening in a world she'd been taken out of, and putting it down made it permanent in a way I couldn't bear." She looked at her hands on the closed ledger. "The accounts don't feel like that," she said. "Numbers don't have sentiment. I can do numbers without feeling like I'm recording a world that belongs to a before. Maybe that's where you start, I said, before you get back to the other kind. She was quiet for a long time. Maybe, she said. The night before the resurvey results arrived, Nora came to the post in the evening and found Saguaro there. He came occasionally after the first visit, when trade or information required it. He and Dell had established a practical working relationship that operated largely outside of Hartwick's awareness, which was a thing both parties preferred. Nora had been present for 2 of these visits, and on each occasion she and Saguaro had exchanged a few words that I hadn't caught, and that neither reported to me in detail. This time I was there. She came in from her evening walk and stopped when she saw him. He turned from the counter where Dell was measuring out tobacco. He said something in Apache that I didn't catch. His wife, who had accompanied him, translated. The woman who reads the land like water reads a slope. Nora looked at me. I shrugged. I hadn't quite understood either, but it felt like a compliment in the structure of it. "Tell him thank you," she said. His wife translated. Saguaro responded. His wife said, "He says the land doesn't need thanking. The land will decide what it allows. He is thanking the decision to try." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had reasons." It sounded like she was explaining something to herself as much as to him. His wife translated. Saguaro replied. His wife said, "He says everyone has reasons. He says the difference between the ones who help and the ones who don't is not the reasons. The reasons are the same. The difference is the direction." She looked down. She pressed her hand flat on the counter, not the table this time, but the same gesture, the same need for something solid. When she looked up, there were no tears. She wasn't a woman who cried publicly, and I had come to understand this was not coldness, but the opposite, that the feeling was so large she could only manage it by holding very still around it. "Yes," she said, "all right." I don't know exactly what she meant. I didn't ask. In December, she told me she wasn't leaving in the spring. I hadn't asked. I'd been carefully not asking, the way you don't disturb an arrangement that's working by demanding it name itself. She said it in the morning at the bench outside the post with the mountains behind her and her breath visible in the cold air. "I thought I'd be moving on," she said. "That's what I thought when I got here, that this was a stop." She paused. "I think it might be a place." "It's a reasonable place," I said. "Dell needs someone who can keep his accounts permanently. He hasn't said it, but he's been getting older and his eyes aren't what they were." She looked at the mountains. "There's work here. There's something to do that matters." She paused. "And Saguaro said something last week." "What did he say?" She smiled, a real one, small, the kind that appears unexpectedly. "He said the land takes its time making room for the people it decides to keep." I looked at her. "I think I might let it decide," she said. I wrote that down later. I wrote almost all of it down, the whole 3 months, the bench, the ledger, the letter, the things Saguaro's wife had translated about the direction. I put it all in the journal in the careful way I keep the journal, with the date at the top of each entry and the scratching out of words that don't earn their space. At the bottom of the December entry I wrote, "She arrived with a grief that had been going nowhere for 2 years. She left it, not behind, because you don't leave something like that behind, but pointed towards something. I don't know what to call what that is. The journal doesn't have the word for it yet." I left space below that sentence. I thought I might need it later. Here is the thing about Emmett Crail that his journal doesn't say directly. It implies it, in the way journals imply things, through what's recorded and what's omitted, and how long he lingers on a particular entry. Which is that he had been, in the 3 years between Gettysburg and her arrival, a man whose grief had gone nowhere useful. He had the ranch. He had the journal. He had Dell's coffee and Saguaro's occasional conversation and the particular silence of the New Mexico high desert, which is a silence that doesn't comfort so much as endure. He had not, in 3 years, written a letter to anyone about anything. The letter to the land office was, technically, the first thing he'd drafted that was directed outward, toward a world he was still part of but had stopped fully engaging. He doesn't say this in the journal, he doesn't connect it. But the entries before October 1874 have a quality of pure documentation, record-keeping, observation, inventory. After October, they start to open up in small ways, longer sentences, more questions left unanswered on the page, More I don't know where before there was only I noted. You can measure a person's return to the world in the way their writing changes. That's what she did to him. That's what he did to her. Neither of them had language for it at the time. Probably they didn't need it. On the last entry of the year, December 31, 1874, Emmett Crail wrote, "She came in broken. She came in with the specific breakage of someone who has carried something heavy so long they've forgotten what upright feels like. I know this because I was the same. I just had more time to get used to the weight. What I saw that nobody else bothered to look for, the muscle underneath the breakage. Not strength in the way people mean when they say a woman is strong, something more specific, the capacity to direct. Grief without direction breaks a person slowly. Grief with a shape to push toward, even a temporary shape, even a letter to a land office, even someone else's problem that happens to fit the size of your anger. That grief builds something instead of consuming it. She didn't arrive healed. She arrived with the material. I think I may have been standing at the trading post with the same material for 3 years, waiting for someone to recognize it. Hale, I think you would have liked her. I think she would have seen through you in about 11 minutes, which you would have found insufferable and eventually respected. I'll tell her about you in the new year.